My walk to school with my mum, this was in about early 1950s, I'll say. We lived on Grammar School Road, very quiet in those days, not so much traffic of course, and Mum used to take me to school on her bicycle, and I rode in a little basket seat on the back of her bike, but most of the time she walked with it. So we went over Grammar School Road and into Bankloke, and the first property was a very large house. Well, I thought it was very large when I was a little girl, and Mr. and Mrs. Cameron lived there with their spaniel dog. Then we went to the Corn Hall, where my mum used to say during the war the soldiers were billeted, but at this time I don't think it was really used for anything, but Ladbrokes Engineering then moved in some years after that. And then after that there was a big wooden fence, and behind that it seemed like magic to me because it was a big garden, never could see it though, with a tennis court on it and a big greenhouse where they grew grapes, and that belonged to the bank manager, and that was lovely. Very near to that was an enormous stone, and it seemed as if it was as big as me, and I always wondered where it came from. And I've learned in later years it was what they called a stepping stone. Whether it was there naturally or whether somebody put it there, I don't know. Next to the stone was Randall's Smithy and Ironmongery, and I think my friend's dad worked in there, Mr. Joe Turner. But I didn't used to take much notice because it was a dirty place. And so on we went, and next to that was another building which I think belonged to the bank, but didn't ever know what was in there. On the other side of the road were some interesting buildings. Edward's Bakery was there, and on Good Friday we used to smell the hot cross buns. It was a lovely smell, and we were allowed to go and get them, and they were hot out of the oven, and that was great. And next to that was Mr. Watts's auction room, and he also ran the labour exchange, and that was a bit dull, so as a child you don't really take much notice of it. And then there was two nice little cottages where I can remember the Hedge family lived, but can't remember who lived in the other one. And then we came to a printer's, and next to that I think was another part that belonged to Boots the chemist, where they used to put all their stock. And then there was another part that belonged to Lings the chemist, where they used to have their stock. These were all behind big wooden doors, so you never knew what was there. Then there was a little concrete space, and a van was always parked on there, and maybe a trade bike, which belonged to the LCM, the London Meat Company, and that was run by Mr. Leatherdale at the time. And then the back of the bank was on the other side of the road. As we came out of Bankloke, we were into the marketplace, and of course not really very many cars around. I perhaps only saw one or two on the way to school. Mostly people were on their bicycles or walking. Boots the chemist was already there on the right hand side, and next to that was the London Meat Company. Then we got to the fruit and vegetable shop, which I think was Mr. Sims, I think. And then we went to Curry's shop, which to me as a little girl was lovely because they had big toys in there. And I always made my wish list very early for Christmas. On the opposite side would have been Marjorham's clothes shop, which used to supply the Parston Grammar School with their uniform. Then I think there was an estate agent's, might have been Ireland's, but that was again was a bit of a dull building. Then we came to Edward's cake shop, which I was allowed to go to sometimes, not on my way to school, but on the way home. Edward's cake shop, and then we had Mr. and Mrs. Hancock's jewellery shop. Of course, all glistening with lovely jewellery in there. And then we will go back to the other side of the road until I can recall what's on the other side again. We would go past the opening to the Black Swan Loke. Fire's cake shop and restaurant was next, with again lovely cream cakes in the windows and a display of wedding cakes, I think, in one shop window. Then we went to Randall's with all their types of small garden machinery and 2 big window displays. But I think most of their stock used to come out onto the path. It must have taken them quite a time to do this, but it was nice to look at. Next to that was the Cross Keys, and had been a pub for a long, long time. Again, going over to the other side of the Market Street, after Hancock's jewellery shop, I think, was Mrs. Long, the sweet shop. And then next to that was Mr. Dolman, who was a barber and hairdresser. Then we go round the corner, and that was opposite the church on the corner was Peacock's, to me a great big shop which sold all sorts of things for the house, toys, sweets, etc. And next to that was Rust's, quite a big grocer's shop, and in those days things weren't all in boxes. You'd go in and you could ask for 2 ounces of something and they'd just weigh it up for you, and usually wrap it in a little blue bag, which always intrigued me, and I used to like to play with them afterwards. Then we'd come to another pub. We had lots of pubs in North Walsham in those days, called the Buck, and then there was another gap too, which went round the back there, and then there was another shop, and unfortunately I can't remember the owner of the shop, but I know they did penny ice lollies, and that was wonderful to have on the way home from school. Next to that was somebody who everybody in North Walsham and surrounding areas can always remember, and that is Claude Pitcher's newsagent shop. I don't know how long he'd had it, but you really couldn't get anything else into the shop. It was stacked from ceiling to floor with all sorts of magazines, comics. Some of them were quite old, but he still hoped to sell them, and he was quite a character. Always had a cigarette in his mouth, but he never had a fire. That was quite a miracle. From there we went to yet another pub, the White Swan, which I think is still there. Then we'd go on to the top of Hall Lane. To the left, in the corner, was Mr. Palmer's fruit shop, and of course selling fruit and vegetables, but also penny packets of crisps. They were all small bits that I think they used to sweep up from the main crisps that got sold, but as a child you loved them. But always remember when the plums were in season, loads of wasps would hover around outside the shop, and I was really frightened to go in. And next to that was Mr. Mace's shoe shop, and that's where my mum would go and get my shoes for me. And then we'd continue down Hall Lane towards the county primary school, and Dog Yard was still there with lots of lovely little houses, and then the Salvation Army Hall was there beside that. Opposite there was the George Edward Memorial Hall, and was still used as a hall, and the school children used to come back up the road to have their school dinners in there in all weathers. And we'd continue down Hall Lane with the little cottages on the left-hand side. And there was one area which I was always intrigued. It was a yard, and I think some cars were made in there, but being only a child I really didn't take much notice. But I can remember a wooden hand cart always standing there, obviously from days gone by. And off we went down the school, past the little houses and into what I thought was a lovely little school. At the time, Miss Pullen was the headmistress, and she was a very, very stern lady, and nobody would dare say anything to her. But the teachers were nice, and on my first day at school, Because I cried, I was allowed to play with the doll's house up the corner for about a half an hour. That's my memory of my first day at school. I was taken home for dinner. I didn't have to stay, but didn't think I had to go back for the afternoon. I thought that was my time at school. But back I went, but Mum used to bike on the way back with me in the seat. And that was my journey to school, and it's always been remembered with great love and affection of my little town.